Kevin Durant was tasked with leading the Brooklyn Nets to a big win over the crosstown New York Knicks, and he did just that, answering the bell with a 53-point performance, reminding the league how dominant he can be, grabbing the Nets their third straight victory as they continue this push towards the playoffs. Dagger triple late, fully in his bag, unstoppable on both ends of the floor to some extent. This was all of those playoff rivalry kind of vibes, and the Nets managed to come out on top. We break it all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, yes. Welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, covering those Brooklyn Nets and also breaking down the New York Football Giants offseason over on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, and remind you that today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered all season long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And where we start, friends, is right where we should, with the Brooklyn Nets needing to lock in, find ways to get wins, and continue that push towards the playoffs on a Sunday afternoon. Kevin Durant gets the job done. This is a game, as we'll talk about some of the supporting performances from the Brooklyn Nets, the way that the Knicks approach defending or not defending Kevin Durant early and then late in this game, and what felt like, as we continue to say, every single time the Nets step on the court, it's going to be playoff level intensity. It's going to be getting the best effort from the opposition. No different in this game, but as Kevin Durant stepped onto the court without Kyrie Irving, though he was on the sidelines in the stands, front row, checking it out, as was visually and optically totally normal. You also didn't have Seth Curry in this one. You also did not have LaMarcus Aldridge. And those three players represent a significant pool of offensive firepower for the Brooklyn Nets. But when you get a 53-point performance on 19 of 37 from the field, dropped 9 dimes in as well, and also got to the line 12 times, knocking down 11. This is what we keep coming back to, even in the absence, whether it's through injury or because of current circumstances with the mandate, even when it's just Kevin Durant on the court for the Brooklyn Nets, you expect to win these games. Now, we can debate about whether or not the Nets should have put the Knicks away sooner or it shouldn't have been as close as it was down the stretch. But when Kevin Durant knows that he needs to be the dominant force, he came out early and often in this one and sent the message that we've been talking about this with Kyrie or without him, sent the message, I'm fully in my bag. I'm going to put this team on my back offensively. Had 27 first half points, just duplicated that process into the second half as well, and showed why. When you look at the different matchups that can get thrown at Brooklyn on a game-to-game basis, the one thing that we always speak to over the course of this season or since his time joining Brooklyn and just his NBA career as a whole, Kevin Durant is a unique player that does not have this weakness in his game that affords you the ability to say, well, let's go with a bigger player, get a little more physical. Kevin Durant's quick enough to create the space, has the length to rise up above you. If you try to defend him small, it's again the height that really becomes an issue for you. Even though we saw Mitchell Robinson did have a block in this one, we'll gloss over that. But his skills are as such that you don't have to worry about what the opposition is going to throw at you. And I thought that the byproduct that we'll get into here with the supporting cast, when you don't have Kyrie Irving, you knew you weren't going to have, but then not having Seth Curry, we specifically talked about how you brought him in this trade to be now, look at the stats. Since he joined the team, he's your third best scorer. So you take him away as well. It's one less option that the Nets have, that Kevin Durant has, to space this floor and really give some different looks to create an offensive rhythm. And yet early, he leaned into someone who's been having a great run, Bruce Brown. We'll talk about him a little later. We leaned into a little bit more of Andre Drummond, and I thought the communication, the facilitation that Kevin Durant was able to roll through while still getting his own, while still getting to the line in this game was important. Now, the sequences that closed this one out and the defense that the Knicks tried to throw at Kevin Durant and the Nets to a degree of success in this fourth quarter, it certainly presented wrinkles. But when you can have the type of rhythm that Kevin Durant was in over the first 3+ quarters, it does get you to a place, I think, late in these games where it does feel like a matter of when, not if, Kevin Durant is going to get those looks. And we'll go to the late game here with 55 seconds left. We talk about fourth quarter adjustments. All of a sudden, the Knicks start bringing those waves, the blitzing defense, sending a second defender out at Kevin Durant at the top of the key, beyond the arc even, and trying to force him to get the ball out of his hands. It led to some careless plays. It led to some turnovers, some disjointed possessions. But on the key sequence when it mattered most, Kevin Durant was able to come around the right side of the arc, pick up the pass, and then use his length, step back into an open look over a defender and a half, we could say, and dagger a triple that put up the Nets 106-103. Came back down the other way. There's a quick bucket on the interior for the Knicks, makes it 106-105. They end up having at one point a chance to miss and try to get the rebound on RJ Barrett, who frustratedly ends up making, with barely touching the rim, makes his free throw, which is a difficult thing to do, as we know, for NBA players. And the Nets end up going the other way, getting key inbounds, getting to the line, finding a way to get it into Kevin Durant so he can go and ultimately close this one out. But we say this so often, and I'll go back to why when we have these discussions, concern level around the Brooklyn Nets. I know that it looked clunky. We know that Kevin Durant wasn't on the floor. We know we're still waiting for Ben Simmons. But if you give me one at this point of the season with the schedule in front of them, I feel good, even if it's all the way down to the wire, that Kevin Durant can lead the Brooklyn Nets to a victory. That Kevin Durant can get you the win. He can will you to the win when it matters. And in a game like this, where you knew there was going to come a point in the fourth quarter when it was going to be either, can we find someone else to make a big shot, or can I, Kevin Durant, find a way to create my own space and to get the looks? He had another thunder slam in this one where the lane virtually opened up. Ruben Randall, Julian, throw a shout out to a former New York Giant. Julius Randle was caught looking across the lane at his teammates as Kevin Durant once again drove and had a throwdown jam like he did against the 76ers. This is a guy that is in lockdown mode. A lot of people talk about, once you see Kevin Durant not really taking care of the goatee, starting to look a little straggly, not cleaning up his line, that's when you know this guy is fully into lockdown mode looking at those playoffs. And you could see Kyrie Irving on the sidelines absolutely locked in on this game as well, and pumping his fist, showing the grin when Kevin Durant knocked down that dagger that really was the put away blow here for the Brooklyn Nets. We're going to get into how this game started. Again, Bruce Brown, Andre Drummond, the sequences that they were able to be effective on early in this game, matchups that I think should have been plus for the Knicks, and the Nets were able to somehow take advantage of those. And then coaching philosophies around what Brooklyn was able to do with some of their role and rotation players, because when you only have one, Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving, and no Seth Curry, etc., you do have to find a way to look to some other components on this team and say, you got to give me something. You have to give me a little run here, because there are going to be those lulls. And 37 shot attempts, as good as it was, we know there is a threshold where fatigue will start to take a factor here. The Nets were able to successfully navigate those waters and come up with another big win. We're going to dive into that right after, of course, we tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. That's because I'm sure that Kevin Durant was loaded up on the protein-packed, 100% covered in real chocolate protein bars from Built Bar. They have all the delicious flavors. We told you about them before. Maybe he even got his hands on one of the new Built Bar Puffs. That is a protein, first of its kind, protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, as Kevin Durant would say, marshmallow-y, and of course, delicious and covered in 100% real chocolate, just like all the other bars. And when you get into these bars, you see from those stat lines just how good they can be in being a part of your daily routine, because most bars have only 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, only 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. I'm telling you, compare them with that candy bar you think about reaching out for. It's going to hit you with over 240 calories and a disgusting 30 plus grams of sugar. Why would you bother doing it when you know Built Bar is available for you? You can head over to built.com and try mint brownie, coconut almond, new this month, white chocolate cookies and cream. They are all delicious and new flavors are coming out all the time. And if you think that the flavor might be good, you know that they're going to be making it for you. It will be delicious and, as always, good for you over on built.com. So then we talk about the late game sequences that lead to the victory here. I think when you look across, and we talked about this in the Charlotte game, obviously the big matchup against the 76ers was absolute elation for Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Nets fan base. But when you look at this game and you look at the Knicks, this one was tight. And again, Charlotte tried to push late. Ultimately, the Nets handled their business with a little bit more calm and a little bit more wiggle room in that particular game. But you should be able to beat the Knicks. When you look at the team on the court, Kevin Durant's the best player. He almost always is going to be the best player on the court. Now, the difference in this game, when you don't have Seth Curry and you don't have Kyrie and you don't have LaMarcus Aldridge, the Nets do get very thin from an offensive perspective in a game like this, and it is what makes Kevin Durant's performance that much more impressive. You go inside the box score, we talked about 53 points from Kevin Durant. Now, by the end of it, there's two players that I think really stood out and played a big role throughout this game, but especially early. And that was Bruce Brown and Andre Drummond. They combined a 15 of 22 from the field. Drummond pitching in 8 of 8. A lot of his work done on the interior, right around the basket. 17 rebounds, though, and that's an even split there, 7-10 in favor of Drummond, and 33 points kicked in overall. They were critical. In a game like this, we've talked so much about Bruce Brown and how good he's been. But we've also talked about how the reason why he's been able to be so effective is because the addition of Seth Curry in the trade, we've seen a great chemistry between the two of them. Curry clearly represents, after Durant and after Kyrie Irving, the best shot creator in his own right. He also has a great court vision. He knows when to make the extra pass and facilitate. And then Drummond as well. Bruce Brown has seen some nice chemistry there too. But when you step onto the court with this lineup and Dragic got inserted into the starting lineup with no Seth Curry, you had to at least wonder, well, what is Bruce Brown going to look like in a game when you don't have more perimeter shooting and more floor spacing? It turns out that he was able to be just as effective. 7 of 14 from the field, did a lot of his work in tandem with Kevin Durant, getting in towards the basket, continued to do all the little things on the defensive end. But I also like the fact that on top of the 7 rebounds, 5 assists in this game to go along with his 2 steals. Like, this is in 41 minutes, by the way. 41 minutes, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals, picked up the 4 personal fouls like he always does. Like, he's always going to be the extra secondary defender that comes over. He's going to be willing, to take some of those fouls, but 15 points for him. This is a massive game for him to show that he's still capable of finding ways to be effective when it's not predicated purely on floor spacing from other knockdown shooters, especially in a game where you had Goran Dragic and Patty Mills go a combined 5 of 19 from the field. It was not happening for them, even though Dragic gave you 6 assists and Patty Mills gave you 4. A lot of these role players leaned into what they are capable of doing well when other things aren't working for them. And sometimes that can be finding Kevin Durant and getting the heck out of his way. But I really thought that Bruce Brown, who has been on this surge for the Brooklyn Nets, continued to show that in this game. His confidence level is as high as it's ever been. And the one thing that you notice with him is when he starts to get downhill attacking at the basket, it's a delicate balance because he has to go in like a bull in a china shop to get at the rim and give himself an opportunity to finish. When he's playing with confidence, though, he looks to get there and finish. We've talked about how good his floater has been, but I think sometimes you can get into a dangerous area when you're caught camping out in the lane, receiving that pass, and then looking to perform that little turnaround floater. It can be effective, but in a game like this, when you have Julius Randle, when you have Mitchell Robinson, when you're going to have some stretches of Obi Toppin in there as well, there's a lot of bodies, is the point, on the interior that certainly could affect or impact that being a viable option. But when you get out and you're playing at pace, all of a sudden, taking those outlet feeds and getting downhill and attacking before the defense has an opportunity to get set, that's how Bruce Brown is able to be effective on the offensive end. He showcased that again tonight. On an Andre Drummond side of things, This was an impressive game, I think, from him, especially on the offensive end, for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, there was a handful of extra possessions, offensive rebounds that he was able to get in and around traffic, and he's just a big, thick body, and it's somewhat surprising because I wouldn't say this guy is known to have the biggest verticality in the world, but he does know how to use his body. He knows how to create space for himself underneath the basket and effectively go back up and finish at the rim. On top of that, he was able to do something that I was surprised the Knicks didn't seem to have an adjustment for, especially early on, and that was using the backboard to shield off the second defender. He was effectively working time and time again, going back to the well on the fake reverse spin away and finish with the opposite hand, using again that backboard and the sideline as kind of that barrier to shield off defenders. He did 8 of 8, 18 points, 10 rebounds, incredibly effective in that role for the Brooklyn Nets. And that these things happened a lot early in the game, where while Kevin Durant was getting 27 points in the first half, Bruce Brown was still able to get his looks. Andre Drummond was able to be effective on the interior. And as I say, when you look around the rest of this box score for Brooklyn and you don't see anyone else except for Nicholas Claxton, who we'll get to here in a second, in double digits after those top three players, you needed this because without Seth Curry and Kyrie Irving, the first thing you think is, well, Patty Mills, Goran Dragic, Cam Thomas, who only played 8 minutes, just doesn't look like he's quite fully back from that little injury and the back situation that he's dealing with. But that's who you're going to look to. Can you guys step up and be effective and knock down some shots? The answer in this particular game was no. And yet the Nets were able to find a way to have success in spite of the absence of perimeter shooting. And even Bruce Brown, he only took one 3-point attempt in this game. It didn't go down. He took that one 3-pointer and said, that's it. I'm going to go back to what I know and to how I know I can be effective against this New York Knicks defense. The other player, I think, if we're going to just talk about the effective guys that were able to do work off of Kevin Durant in this one, it was Nicholas Claxton. And he only played in a total of 21 minutes. Actually, I shouldn't say only because 21 minutes is right about on par for him. And I just thought that he did a really good job. 4 or 6 from the field. We know the working around there. A couple little turns and flips in the lane that have gone down for him. He's playing with a bit more confidence. But 2 or 3 at the line as well. Gave you the 5 total rebounds and assists, 2 steals, and a block as well to go along with the 10 points. It's hard. I said over on Twitter, this is a guy that you love and you hate. He's up, he's down, he's in the lineup, he's buried, he's traded, he's re-signed. All of these different emotions that you ride with Nicholas Claxton. Now, in the absence of LaMarcus Aldridge, you had to be able to look to him because I thought, and we saw some James Johnson minutes in this one as well, but I thought that Blake Griffin would be a guy that, in the absence of Aldridge, you would go back to that well. As it stands right now, they're not looking to him. And maybe Steve Nash is looking to see if Nick Claxton can give you some of these key effective minutes, and he's been able to do it. 10 points offensively, again, in a game like this, it was critical. The things that he can do defensively, the switchability, it was critical. Came up with a nice block. When you look, again, go back to the 76ers game. When you look at the matchups, there are players that are bigger and capable of being more physical than Claxton on both ends of the floor. And yet, of late, Claxton has shown you that he's starting to figure out, if I'm not bigger and stronger, which he often will not be, then how do I find a way to still be effective? We saw it against Joel Embiid, where he was using his quickness to try to reach in on Embiid without getting caught on the swing through from Joel. We saw it in this game where whether switching on defensively on Julius Randle, getting out there on Evan Fournier for some of these stretches as well. And then on the offensive end, I can't be a guy that's just going to straight go in and bang bodies, but I am someone that can find space and either create a little bit of room for myself and try to get it up or look to outlet to someone else here. Just the one assist in this game, but we know something he's capable of. Other little tip of the hat that we'll get to here in a second is going to be James Johnson, and then just a sense of where the Knicks tried to go in this game, I thought, and arguably where I think they made an enormous mistake and something that the Nets will need to be wary of or aware of if you're not going to have a Seth Curry in the lineup and for games at home right now when Kyrie will not be available. We'll get into that right after we tell you about, of course, our friends over at BetOnline. That's because we know March Madness is just around the corner here, dialing up as all these seedings start to fall into place. And that means that from the latest odds, contests, and player props, betonline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcast, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all the sporting wagering information needs. Very official. And also including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. You head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. Bet online, where the game starts. So as we start to wrap it up here, the last tip of the hat to James Johnson. You're going to look at the box score and you're not going to see anything too pretty from him. Did not pitch in all but 2 points in this one, but played 31 minutes, 1 of 5 from the field, 5 rebounds. I thought that was important. He is again, I feel like if you put the what are those little nesting dolls? If you opened up Andre Drummond, the smaller version would be James Johnson. He's effective in the same way. He's a little more athletic than you anticipate for his body type. And in this game, in a game where you were not going to be, where you might want to be offensively driven, and it was not going well for you, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, 3 steals. That was critical. Ends up fouling out in the late sequences of this game. But I thought that he, Bruce Brown, Drummond, all of these guys, Nicholas Claxton, like these were actually defensive minded players who were either able to be effective offensively, as we said at the top with Brown and Drummond, or lean into your value here. Look at the matchups and try to be as effective as you can and steal a few possessions. When you're Claxton and James Johnson and you combine for 5 steals, that is 5 offensive possessions that you take away from the New York Knicks. And in a game that was going down to the wire, that was being played incredibly close, when you look at some of the production that you were getting, 5 of 8 from beyond the arc for Fournier, you have to look at that and say, every time that we can take one of those possessions off the table for the Knicks and save a possession in terms of the effort and energy that Kevin Durant has to expel when you get out in transition going the other way and looking for easy buckets, specifically with a Bruce Brown, that is how you save yourself a 107-110 victory, as opposed to maybe finding yourself down 4, 5, 6 points in the late game sequences, looking for Kevin Durant to bail you out and living with those results, as you would if it came down to that. And the last thing, just before we talk about, I think a coaching decision from the Knicks side that felt like a mistake, if I'm being honest. Inside of this game, as we say, the Nets are often outshot in a game on a game-to-game basis, 83 to 89, 6 plus in the shot attempt margins. Also shot a better field goal percentage at nearly 50% from the field. Neither team was good from beyond the arc, as we said, and then getting to the line at nearly an even clip. Nets only knocking down 73% there, though. This is a game where those turnovers matter because you're stealing possessions to help even out the fact that you did have 23 turnovers in this game. The Knicks had 21. So there was a little bit of this that I felt like the Nets caught themselves, and we'll close out on this, caught themselves buying into or leaning into maybe Kevin Durant a little bit too much. And what I mean by that is the Nets knew what the personnel was going to be here. Now they kind of get a favor from the Knicks, in my opinion. As you get into the latter sequences of the fourth quarter, the Knicks start blitzing Kevin Durant, sending the second defender to meet him out there beyond the arc. And you saw how disruptive it was, because now all of a sudden, with the personnel you have available, when Kevin Durant needs to get that ball out of his hands, well, he can look to Dragic. You can look to Patty Mills, who's having an off night. If the ball gets into Bruce Brown's hands, he has shown of late a better percentage from the outside, but that's not going to be the first thing that he looks to do. And then you're talking about Drummond, the James Johnsons of the world, the Nicholas Claxtons when they're out on the floor. There's not a lot of easy outlet passes that create viable open looks. You even saw Kevin Durant, who on one of these sequences got it out to the perimeter through, I think, James Johnson to Patty Mills. Patty Mills passed on the perimeter shot, went to the interior, tried to dump it off, ended up being a turnover. And Durant said, you got to fire those shots because we know creating those looks is going to be more difficult. And it's why the blitzing defense came from the Knicks. In that vein, though, if I'm Thibodeau, I don't know what you're doing from the word go here. If you are not trying to take the ball out of Kevin Durant's hands on every single possession from the tip. Because whether or not Patty Mills was going to hit a better percentage, or Dragic was going to get to the cup a little bit more, or James Johnson and Bruce Brown were going to do, Drummond and Bruce Brown were going to do what they did and combine for an incredible performance, 33 total offensive points between the two of them. I'm going to live with those results. And it just did not seem like the Knicks were willing to do that early and often enough. And this is the one, not concern, because the likelihood that you're going to be without Seth Curry and LaMarcus Aldridge and Kyrie Irving with consistency is not going to be the case going forward. But I do think you just need to remember that when you get caught in these games where it's an all or nothing Kevin Durant performance, you still need the supporting cast to be available for you. You still need to find a way to have that rhythm, because in the latter stages of this one, you were only one or two more turnovers away from, again, being down by 5 or 6 and looking for a bailout from Kevin Durant. And when you see him get frustrated with Patty Mills for not taking that look, that's just a confidence thing. Keep firing. We know you're struggling, but keep firing. He hit 1 in the fourth quarter. But you have to reward Kevin Durant with a win, right? So you cannot afford to have this one slip away from you, let alone what it means from an implication standpoint in the standings, which we'll touch on here before we go. But you have to make sure that throughout this game, you're still finding a way to present reasonable threats. And in some regards, I think the Knicks did the Nets a favor here by not putting more pressure on Kevin Durant early in this game and saying, I want to see Dragic knock down open looks. I want to see Patty Mills. I want to see Bruce Brown get even more shot attempts from the field. Prove to me that Bruce Brown can hit these with consistency, right? Get the ball into Nicholas Claxton's hands when he is on the floor offensively and see if he can beat you. Foul him and send him to the line. These are some of the things that I just think that whether or not the Nets got lucky or they gave enough of a sample size early on with non-perimeter shooters being effective on the offensive end to keep Thibodeau from looking to do some of those things defensively. Either way, it's a win. It's another win. It's the third win in a row, but you need to take some of these sample sizes and say, how do we make sure that we avoid these going forward? And some of that can be as simple as saying, well, let's make sure that we have Seth Curry back out on the court. And now you have this guy who, again, can create on ball, can knock down from the perimeter, can facilitate. That changes the entire look at this game. If you give me either one of those players, but especially if you give me Seth Curry, and I was mentioning LaMarcus Aldridge as being the other one, not Kyrie Irving. If you give me Seth Curry in this game, the Nets win by 10 plus. Simple as that. Because he is not, unlike a Patty Mills, Seth Curry has the ability to be effective from anywhere on the floor. Doug said it last time, 3-level scorer here. From a standing standpoint, we come in, we're recording this one ahead of the 7 o'clock game that's going to tip off here between, you're going to have Atlanta and the Pacers go at it here. Orlando's taking on Philly. You wouldn't expect them to lose, etc. But this does remain an important game for the Brooklyn Nets, obviously keeping themselves in that standing margin, making sure that they're going to keep themselves entrenched in the 7th or 8th seed and then trying to look forward. The interesting thing actually has been Toronto Raptors have won 3 in a row here, not something that we necessarily anticipated from them. So while it keeps distance ahead of them in the 7th seed, the Cleveland Cavaliers remain just 2.5 games ahead of the 2.5 games are Toronto, 3.5 are the Cleveland Cavaliers in the 6th spot, but they are not putting distance between. So we'll start to consider the idea of how much ground can the Nets try to reasonably make up here, because as we know, as it stands right now, this would be the Nets going on the road to Toronto, regardless of what happens in the city. Kyrie Irving would not be able to play there in that first play-in game, and then you get into the games in behind them here. But we'll certainly keep an eye on the Atlanta Hawks matchup. They remain right now 3 games up in the 10th spot over Washington, and Charlotte is in a tie with them, virtual tie there, 1 in the loss column. So we'll see how these games shake out. Effectively, it looks like the Nets are in a great spot here over the course of the remainder of the season. And we know we'll dial back up in here, talk about takeaways from this one, talk about getting Seth Curry back on the floor, and we'll update the mandate. We'll update Ben Simmons as well when we come back in on Tuesday. Until then, my friends, off of that 53-point performance for Kevin Durant, beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful. Mary Shelley. We'll be back again in next time. Hit us up on YouTube, follow, like, subscribe, talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.